The Victorian era, a time of great social and industrial change, also saw the rise of the modern prison system. This period was marked by a belief in progress and reform, yet the reality within the prison walls often told a different story. These institutions, intended to deter crime and reform offenders, were often grim and unforgiving places. The architecture itself was designed to intimidate, with towering walls and narrow claustrophobic corridors. Overcrowding, disease and harsh punishments were commonplace. Cells meant for one or two inmates often held many more, leading to unsanitary conditions and the rapid spread of illness. Prisons became symbols of fear and despair, reflecting the societal anxieties of the age. The isolation and harsh conditions were intended to break the will of the prisoners, making them compliant and penitent. The Victorian belief in hard labour and moral discipline shaped the penal system. Prisoners were often subjected to exhausting and monotonous tasks, such as breaking rocks or turning a crank for hours on end. Prisons were not just for confinement, they were intended to break the spirit and instill obedience. Guards maintained strict discipline, and any sign of defiance was met with severe punishment. The reality, however, often fell short of the ideal. Many prisons were underfunded and poorly managed, leading to neglect and further suffering for the inmates. Instead of rehabilitation, many prisoners faced brutality and degradation. The harsh conditions and lack of proper medical care often left them worse off than when they entered, perpetuating a cycle of crime and punishment. Stepping inside a Victorian prison was to enter a world of misery. Cells, often designed for one, housed multiple inmates. Sanitation was poor, leading to outbreaks of typhus, cholera, and other diseases. Food was meagre, barely enough to sustain life. The lack of hygiene and proper nutrition took a toll on the prisoners' physical and mental health. Many succumbed to disease, while others suffered from despair and mental breakdown. The silence system enforced in many prisons further isolated inmates, forbidding them from speaking to one another. Punishment within Victorian prisons was swift and brutal. Flogging, often with a cat o' nine tails, was common for even minor infractions. The treadmill, a soul-crushing device that served no practical purpose, was designed to inflict pain and exhaustion. Another common punishment was solitary confinement. Prisoners were locked in dark, cramped cells for days, weeks, or even months. Deprived of human contact and sensory stimulation, many descended into madness. These practices, far from reforming criminals, often left them physically and emotionally scarred. Ironically, while Victorian society condemned drunkenness, alcohol often flowed freely within the walls of its prisons. Guards, poorly paid and susceptible to corruption, often turned a blind eye to smuggling. Prisoners used alcohol to escape the horrors of their confinement. This rampant alcohol abuse fueled violence and disorder within the prisons. Drunken brawls were common, and the already tenuous grip of authority weakened further. The presence of alcohol, meant to pacify and control, instead exacerbated the chaos and brutality of prison life. To understand the harshness of Victorian prisons, one must consider the societal context. The Victorian era was a time of great social and economic upheaval, marked by rapid industrialization and urbanization. This led to significant changes in the social fabric, with many people moving to cities in search of work, only to find themselves living in squalid conditions. Victorians held a firm belief in personal responsibility and morality. They believed that every individual was responsible for their own actions, and that moral integrity was paramount. This belief was deeply rooted in the religious and cultural values of the time, which emphasized hard work, discipline, and self-reliance. Crime was seen as a moral failing, a sign of character weakness. Those who committed crimes were often viewed as inherently flawed individuals who lacked the moral fortitude to resist temptation. This perspective was reflected in the harsh treatment of criminals, who were often subjected to severe punishments. This view extended even to petty offenses like theft and vagrancy. Minor crimes were not seen as desperate acts of survival, but as clear indications of a person's moral shortcomings. The justice system was unforgiving, with even small infractions leading to harsh penalties. The plight of the poor, often driven to crime by desperation, was rarely considered. Poverty was rampant and many people turned to crime as a means of survival. However, the societal view was that poverty was a result of personal failings rather than systemic issues. Poverty was seen as a consequence of laziness and immorality, not as a societal ill. The poor were often stigmatized and blamed for their own misfortune. This lack of empathy extended to the justice system, where the poor were treated with little compassion. This judgmental attitude towards the less fortunate permeated the justice system, leading to harsh sentences and little sympathy for offenders. The prisons were overcrowded and conditions were brutal, reflecting the belief that punishment should be severe to deter others from committing crimes. The Victorian approach to crime and punishment was thus a reflection of the broader societal values of the time, which prioritized moral rectitude over compassion and understanding. Coldbath Fields Prison in London stood as a notorious example of Victorian prison life at its worst. Overcrowding was rampant, with prisoners crammed into filth. Disease spread like wildfire, and mortality rates were shockingly high. The prison was notorious for his cruelty. He enforced a strict regime of silence and hard labour. Punishments were meted out liberally, often for minor infractions. Coldbath Fields became a byword for brutality, a stark reminder of the dark side of Victorian justice. The legacy of Victorian prisons is complex and multifaceted. While these institutions were undeniably harsh and often inhumane, they also laid the groundwork for modern penal systems. The emphasis on work, discipline and rehabilitation, though often misguided, influenced later reforms. The Victorian era also saw the rise of prison reformers, individuals appalled by the conditions within these institutions. They advocated for more humane treatment, education and rehabilitation programs. Their efforts, though often met with resistance, gradually led to improvements in prison conditions. Victorian prisons, with their squalor, violence and overcrowded conditions, were notorious for their inhumane treatment of inmates. These institutions were designed not just to punish, but to break the spirit of those who were confined within their walls. The harsh conditions, brutal punishments and despair stand as a dark chapter in the history of criminal justice. The daily life of a prisoner was filled with hard labour, minimal food and constant surveillance. The brutal punishments, such as flogging and solitary confinement and pervasive drunkenness, reflected the societal anxieties and moral judgments of the age. The prisons were often filled with individuals who were not hardened criminals, but rather those who had fallen on hard times. Yet, amid the darkness, glimmers of reform emerged, paving the way for a more humane and rehabilitative approach to punishment. Reformers began to advocate for better conditions, education, and the moral improvement of prisoners. The Victorian prison, a place of dread and suffering, also served as a catalyst for change, highlighting the need for a justice system that focused on rehabilitation rather than mere punishment. These early efforts laid the groundwork for modern prison reforms, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit seeks progress and compassion. The transformation of these institutions serves as a testament to the enduring belief in the possibility of redemption and the power of human resilience.